Moses returns to Egypt. The desert stretched endlessly before Moses, silent and vast, with the wind carrying whispers of both solitude and destiny. For 40 years, he had lived in Midian, far away from the palace of Pharaoh where he had once walked with authority, and far from the people of Israel who still groaned in their slavery. Shepherding his father-in-law's flocks, Moses had settled into a life of quiet routine, believing perhaps that his past failures had forever disqualified him from any greater purpose. But one encounter had changed everything. On the slopes of Mount Horeb, he had seen a bush that burned, yet was not consumed. Drawn by curiosity and awe, he had stepped closer, and their God had called him by name. Moses had removed his sandals, for he stood on holy ground. Trembling, he had heard the voice of the Almighty declare that he had seen the suffering of his people in Egypt, and that he would deliver them. And more than that, God had chosen Moses to be his instrument of liberation. At first, Moses resisted. He doubted his ability, feared rejection, and questioned his worthiness. His words faltered as he confessed that he was slow of speech. But God, patient and powerful, reassured him again and again. The Creator of heaven and earth reminded him that the mission did not depend on Moses' strength but on divine power. Signs were given: the staff that turned into a serpent, the leprous hand that was healed, the promise that even water from the Nile could become blood in his hands. Still, Moses hesitated until God appointed Aaron, his brother, to be his spokesman. Together, they would face Pharaoh. Together, they would lead Israel out of bondage. At last, Moses bowed to the will of God, though with trembling heart, and prepared to leave Midian. The quiet life of shepherding was over. A journey of destiny awaited him. Before departing, Moses sought the blessing of Jethro, his father-in-law. With respect, he asked permission to return to his brothers in Egypt to see if they were still alive. Jethro gave his consent with words of peace, and Moses set his family upon a donkey and took with him the staff of God, that sacred instrument now charged with divine authority. The road to Egypt was long, and with each step, Moses felt the weight of both fear and calling. Memories of his past flooded his mind. The day he struck down the Egyptian taskmaster, the rejection from his own people, the flight into the wilderness. Would Pharaoh remember him? Would the Hebrews trust him? Yet, alongside those doubts came the steady reminder that God himself had promised to be with him. Along the way, God spoke again, assuring Moses that those who had once sought his life in Egypt were now dead. The threat from his past was removed, and the path ahead was clear. Yet this journey was not merely a return to a land. It was a return to purpose. Moses was no longer a fugitive but a servant of the Most High, carrying a mission that would alter the destiny of nations. Meanwhile, in Egypt, the cries of the Israelites continued to rise. The weight of oppression grew heavier as Pharaoh's demands increased. The people longed for deliverance, perhaps without knowing that their deliverer was already on the way. Aaron too was being prepared, for God instructed him to go into the wilderness to meet his brother. When at last the two brothers met on the mountain of God, the embrace was filled with both love and divine purpose. Moses recounted all that the Lord had spoken to him and showed Aaron the signs he had been given. Together, they understood that they were part of something far greater than themselves. Arriving in Egypt, their first task was not to confront Pharaoh, but to reach the elders of Israel. The leaders of the enslaved people gathered as Moses and Aaron declared that the God of their fathers had appeared to them. They spoke of the promise of deliverance, of a land flowing with milk and honey, and of the mighty power that would compel Pharaoh to release them. When Moses performed the signs before their eyes, the people believed, and when they heard that the Lord had seen their affliction and was concerned for them, they bowed down and worshipped. The atmosphere was charged with hope, yet fear still lingered. Egypt was the mightiest empire of its time, and Pharaoh's heart was known to be proud and unyielding. To stand before him and demand the release of an entire nation of slaves seemed impossible. But God had already declared what would happen. Pharaoh would resist, his heart would be hardened, and through signs and wonders, the glory of the Lord would be revealed. The day came when Moses and Aaron entered the courts of Pharaoh. The grandeur of Egypt surrounded them, pillars towering high, servants moving swiftly, guards standing ready. Moses, once raised as a prince in this palace, now returned, not with the attire of royalty but with the authority of heaven. With courage born of obedience, they spoke the words of God. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness. Pharaoh's response was one of scorn. Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, nor will I let Israel go. His pride was evident, his heart already set against the command. Instead of granting relief, Pharaoh increased the burdens of the Israelites, demanding the same quota of bricks without providing straw. The people's hope turned quickly to despair. Their anger fell upon Moses and Aaron, accusing them of making their suffering worse. Once again, Moses felt the sting of rejection, the weight of blame. He turned to God with honesty, asking why he had even sent him if things were only getting harder. But God's answer was steadfast. He reminded Moses of his covenant, of the promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He declared that with a mighty hand he would compel Pharaoh, and with outstretched arm he would redeem his people. The deliverance would not come easily, but it would come surely. Step by step, Moses learned that obedience was not about immediate results but about trust in the one who had spoken. The return to Egypt was not a triumphal march but a test of faith, courage, and perseverance. The mission was far from over. In truth, it had only just begun. The confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh would unfold through plagues, signs, and wonders, but the foundation had been laid in that first act of obedience. Moses had returned to Egypt, carrying not his own authority but the authority of the living God. The shepherd had become a prophet, the fugitive a deliverer, and the servant of Midian the chosen instrument of Israel's freedom. And so the story of Moses returning to Egypt resounds through the ages as a testimony of calling, resistance, and divine power. It teaches that God equips those he sends, that his purposes are greater than human fears, and that his deliverance comes not in human strength, but in his mighty hand. The desert had prepared Moses. The burning bush had called him. The staff in his hand had become the symbol of God's presence, and Egypt itself would soon witness that the God of Israel is the Lord over all the earth. Thus, the man who once fled in fear now walked in faith. The land he had left in shame would become the stage of God's greatest acts of deliverance, and the people who cried out in bondage would soon march toward freedom, led by the servant who obeyed the call to return. The narrative of Moses returning to Egypt is not only a story of ancient history, but also a message for every generation. It reminds us that no past failure disqualifies us from God's calling, that no earthly power can stand against the will of the Almighty, and that when God says go, his presence goes with us. The return of Moses was not just his own journey, it was the beginning of Israel's redemption, the dawn of liberation, and the unfolding of a covenant promise that would echo through eternity.